Thank you.
This is the Reader's Digest version. In the following paper, I want to discuss the diverse views in Jewish thought about the holiness of the land of Israel, because understanding the significance of this idea is essential to explaining the hold of the Zionist narrative over the Jewish people. I argue that the holiness of the land is at the heart of the Israeli consensus. For Friends of Israel, the main elements of the Zionist account are clear. In brief, that the Jewish people have a right to their own state on the soil of the historical homeland. Moreover, a secure shelter and haven from persecution was urgently needed in the light of the tragic events of the 20th century. One feature of the Zionist story that may be harder to grasp is the belief in the holiness of the land of Israel, or indeed what holiness means in this context. In the Christian tradition, the term Holy Land refers to the land containing the holy places revered by Christianity because of their association with the life of Jesus Christ. But the Jewish assertion that an area of thousands of square kilometers is holy in its very essence is puzzling. What kind of holiness might infuse a landscape containing, besides places referred to in the Holy Bible, sites of everyday life and work, homes, factories, farms, and so on? I suggest that in the Jewish tradition, the holiness of the land has a threefold meaning. First, that the land was promised by God to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their descendants who remain loyal to the biblical covenants. Second, that it is an eternal heritage, something hallowed by memories that are passed down from one generation to the next. Third, in consequence, that it was and is the setting for the fulfillment of the ordained purpose of the Jewish people. Note that all these varieties of holiness have both spiritual and practical dimensions. In the Jewish tradition, there is no contradiction between the two. Judaism is not a once-a-week religion. Rather, religion and politics, belief and practice, body and spirit go together. Shortly after the Six-Day War of 1967, a movement of prominent Israelis emerged, cutting across party lines, calling for settlement of the whole land of Israel. In English, it was known as the Movement for a Greater Israel. It had a tremendous psychological impact, and in a short time, young idealists set out to settle the newly occupied lands west of the Jordan River, beyond the borders of June the 4th, 1967. Today, almost 50 years later, hundreds of thousands of Jews live in the midst of a pre-existing population of Palestinian Arabs in these territories. Responsibility for this controversial program is commonly laid at the door of two small but highly motivated groups. The first consists of the revisionist followers of Ze'ev Vladimir Jabotinsky, who make up the ideological core of Cherut, freedom, later the Likud party of Menachem Begin and his successors. The second, Gush Emunim, the block of the faithful, consists of the disciples of Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, the son of the prophetic Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. Put in this oversimplified way, the most significant development in the Zionist movement since the foundation of the State of Israel is presented as the work of a fringe minority. But to make sense of the settlement phenomenon, one must look beyond Cherut and Gush Emunim to the silent majority of sympathizers. In fact, the concept of the sanctity of the land of Israel, which inspires these movements, has deep roots in the Jewish tradition. Nor has its impact been limited to a minority. Rather, it has been one of the central influences on Zionist thinking and policy, left and right, religious and secular, Ashkenazi and Sfaradi, from the 19th century to the present day. Jewish thinking about the land of Israel can be traced back to the great Sephardic scholars and mystics of the 12th and 13th centuries, the time of the Crusades. Nachmanides interpreted Numbers chapter 33, verse 53, as a direct biblical command to conquer and settle the land. Quote, "And you shall take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have assigned the land to you to possess." Unquote. The terrestrial land below, down here, was holy because, in a mystical sense, it was connected to and corresponded with the heavenly land above, up there. Rabbi Ezra of Gerona did not believe, in contrast, that there was an enduring duty to settle the land, but was convinced that the land had the power to redeem Israel from the sufferings of exile. Moreover, he saw the land of Israel as the center of the cosmos, and therefore directly linked to the Almighty. Ibn Ezra argued that the land was holy in a very literal way, because it was able to receive and absorb emanations of sanctity transmitted from higher spheres. While other lands were controlled by the stars, only the land of Israel was controlled by God. As long as the Jews were in exile, they had no access to God. Aliyah, ascension to the land, was therefore a supreme obligation. Not all the sages, though, assigned sanctity to the physical land. Abulafia, for instance, saw the land in symbolic terms as an inner state of spirituality. The emergence of the Zionist movement in the last quarter of the 19th century confronted the rabbinical establishment with the threat of internal division. Zionist activists no longer saw themselves bound by the orders of Torah, Their aim was to escape the insular world of the shtetl, the East European Jewish small town. Their inspiration was not the rabbis, but modern thinkers like Mazzini, Darwin, and Nietzsche. As far as the ultra-Orthodox were concerned, these Zionists were the worst challenge to their way of thinking since Napoleon tore down the ghetto walls. It was within this unpromising context that Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the first chief rabbi of Palestine and prophet of modern religious Zionism, developed his mystical theology of the land. The sanctity of the land, which could not be grasped by rational thought, was part of God's plan of salvation, in which exile and purification paved the way for the messianic ingathering and return. Judaism in exile was a pale anticipation of the future redemption, heralded by the return to the land of Israel. Only in the land of Israel could the mitzvot, the ordinances of Torah, acquire their full meaning and the people achieve redemption. If outside Israel is characterized by impurity and alienation from the divine light, the land of Israel, thanks to its closeness to divine truth, is bathed in divine light. Writing during the turmoil of the First World War, Rabbi Kook was convinced of the practical relevance of his theology in the here and now. He saw the Zionist pioneers who built the collective farms and villages as engaged in sacred work in the cause of redemption, even if they did not always know it. Their work on the land, however, raised difficult problems of halakha, Jewish law, that did not exist outside the land of Israel. For instance, according to the Torah, land could not be cultivated in the seventh year. But how could a society survive which left its fields fallow for a year? Rabbi Kook was able to provide Jewish legal solutions to many of these questions. His theology and legal decisions deeply influenced the religious Zionist movement. Thanks to his son and successor, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, his ideas of the holiness of the land inspired the Bloc of the Faithful after the 1967 war. Overall, Rabbi Kook the Elder's thought, both mystical and legal, was not universally accepted by observant Jews, but at the very least served as a bridge between Zionism and ultra-Orthodoxy. Amidst the contemporary debate over conscripting ultra-Orthodox youth into the army, one should not forget that large parts of the religious world have long since made their peace with Zionism. For instance, the Chabad Hasidic movement, rebuilt after the Second World War by its charismatic leader, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, became a strong supporter of the State of Israel and its role in the unfolding of the divine purpose. The Rebbe argued that the return to the land naturally derived from its original ownership. Quote, "Its sanctity did not expire with the exile, but remains to the present day, because the ownership of the land of Israel by the people of Israel is eternal and cannot be conceded until all is revealed with the coming of the just Messiah." Unquote. Agudat Yisrael, the centrist ultra-Orthodox movement founded in Europe in 1912 started out as deeply critical of Zionism, but closed ranks with the Zionist movement in the 1930s at a conference convened, quote, for the sake of the holiness of the land, unquote, in 1934. After the Shoah, the Agudah called on all Jews to settle in the land of Israel. An offshoot workers' movement, Poalei Agudat Israel, established its own agricultural communities. Neither Chabad nor the Agudah endorse Cook's system of thought, but today do affirm the holiness of the land and have large communities in the occupied territories. They are strongly attached to Rachel's tomb on the way to Bethlehem and the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron. Zionist ideology, as opposed to religious thought, has two main streams: revisionist Likud and socialist Labour. For both movements, each in its own way, the land is central. For the revisionist followers of Jabotinsky, however, the land's mystical holiness is explicit. Aryeh Naor, who was cabinet secretary to the first government of Menachem Begin, 1977 to 1982, argues that for the revisionist movement, the earthly land has all the symbolism of the heavenly land. Religious concepts had been secularized. He uses the term secularization of the sacred. But those concepts, though they had been secularized, retained the spiritual resonance of their religious source. So, revisionism has a sort of political theology as much as an ideology. Even the atheistic worldview of its founder Jabotinsky was tinged with the sacred. So here's an atheist who talks in terms of sanctity. He spoke of the Holy Jordan and of the Beitar youth movement consecrated by suffering. Russian pogroms, he wrote, resulted from the estrangement of the Jewish people from their land. So, repossession of the land was vital to end alienation. For the children of Israel, land preceded identity. Quote, Eretz Israel gives the people its name and not the reverse. Revisionist ideology, however, is concerned not with God, but with the nation and the land. By drawing on religious motifs, it strengthens its political claims and mobilizes its constituency. Reference to the Bible legitimizes ideology and puts it beyond criticism. Moreover, the land has precedence over the state because, quote, the land is holy, whereas the state is not holy. So, political values are sanctified within a secular framework. The leading ideologue of revisionism after Jabotinsky died was Yisrael Eldad. He argues that Zionism's goals were clearly messianic, namely, to free the Jewish people, free the land, and gather in the exiles. He accepts that Zionism is a secular movement in the sense that its followers are mostly non-observant Jews. But for him, secular is not the absence of Judaism, which he defines as an ever-changing national culture rather than a fixed set of beliefs. The land acquires supreme value as the place where the Jewish people live and shape their culture. Zionism is the latest form taken by Judaism, and its emphasis on doing, namely building, settling, working the soil, observing immigrants, embodies the tradition of worship through action found in the performance of the mitzvot. In contrast to revisionist Zionism, Labour Zionism carefully avoided the notion of holiness. It was always uncomfortable with talk of a mystical bond to the land. Labour Zionism created a broad ideology which drew on universalistic values rather than religious themes. Speaking a language of international fraternity and reason, leaders such as Golda Meir, Yigal Allon, and Shimon Peres were thoroughly at home in the European mainstream. Labour leaders felt they could not indulge in what they saw as exclusivist rhetoric. They had borne responsibility for the day-to-day handling of the business of the Jewish community in Palestine, diplomatic, political, and economic, from the beginning of the mandate. They understood that to work with the British, gain international support, and build a state from nothing required moderation in word and deed. Even so, under the surface can be detected a mystical attachment to the land of Israel. Like the other Zionist movements, Labour Zionism suspended its ideology, hung its ideology on a frame of sacred history, namely exile, ascent to the land, aliyah, and redemption. A.D. Gordon was the Tolstoy-like prophet of Labour Zionism. His ideology, no less than that of Zionist theorists, is a secularization of the sacred. He studiously avoided religious language, but maintains that the land is the only place where the Jews can develop their national life. Exile, he argues, spawned a state of alienation that can only be redeemed by physical labor on the land. In redeeming the land, the Jews redeem themselves. Gordon rejects the concept of a chosen people, yet still insists that the Jews are special. And so the rehabilitation of the Jewish people by a return to the soil would have universal significance for the rejuvenation of mankind. Other Labour ideologues, such as Yitzhak Tabenkin, also cloaked religious concepts in secular garb. Tabenkin was an ardent advocate of the greater land of Israel throughout his career, although he belonged to the Labour movement, opposing all proposals of partition or withdrawal from the 1930s onwards. After the Six-Day War, he wrote, unquote, "The goal of our entire project was then and remains a greater Israel within its natural and ancient borders, from the Mediterranean to the desert and from the Lebanon to the Dead Sea, as the reborn homeland of the entire Jewish people. This is the original Zionist idea." Unquote. This absolute right to the land of Israel was rooted in the Bible and consecrated by the sacrifice of Israel's sons. The epitome in his generation of the Labour stalwart and non-believer, Moshe Dayan, the second child born on Kibbutz Degania, the first kibbutz, returned towards the end of his life to a mystical belief in the Bible. In his book, which I highly recommend, Living with the Bible, Dayan writes of his own adventurous life against the backdrop of the land of Israel, its landscapes, biblical associations, and battles. He weaves into one fabric the history of the Jewish people in ancient times and in modern times. It's one story for him. The Bible overarches everything as a spiritual inspiration for the rebirth of the nation of Israel, speaking Hebrew in its historical homeland. It was not on momentary impulse that Moshe Dayan accepted the post of foreign minister in Menachem Begin's first Likud government in 1977, though that shocked his former comrades. So the wheel turned full circle. And those who had rejected traditional Zionism for socialism and secularism could no longer disguise the true source of their attachment to the land, a more or less mystical sense of the biblical promise and covenant. The assertion that a land is holy arouses disquiet when it is the basis of an exclusivist and uncompromising political agenda. Inflexible nationalism is no longer popular in the West. The right of the Jewish people to a national home in part of Palestine is one thing. The denial on grounds of sacred principle of the political claims of Palestinian Arabs to a state of their own in the rest of Palestine is quite another. This is the end. Wait, it's not the end, it's the beginning of the end. Anyway.
I've heard that before.
Okay, so a 2013 state of 8 million people is very different in its self-perception and capabilities from a 1956 state of 2 million, when Ben-Gurion agreed to withdraw from the Sinai. If faith in the holiness of the land is as widely held as I claim among religious and non-religious alike, then a two-state solution may no longer be politically viable, if it ever was. Depending on one's beliefs, this is either very good news or very bad news.